Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I am Babs Schaefer with the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. We're going to start the webinar, and I want you to know that this webinar is being recorded. And this is a Sexual Assault Testing and Evidence Collection Act Anonymous Reporting Updates, hosted by the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, the Pennsylvania State Police, and the Pennsylvania chapter of the International Association of Forensic Nurses. So during this webinar, we will do our best to answer questions as we present. So we will try to take time to do that. We have a very content-heavy webinar. We also have a question and answer time set aside at the end of the presentation if we can't get to all of your questions. So during the webinar, if you will use the chat feature for general comments or greetings, and then use the Q&A button. All this should be at the bottom of your screen for specific questions about content. We will be watching that, and we can try to monitor those questions that you may have as best we can. Closed captioning is accessible through the CC button at the bottom of your screen. So if you click on that, you should be able to read captioning. And then during this webinar, we really encourage you to follow along with the anonymous reporting and testing form that was included with your materials. We think it'll be very helpful if you're looking at that while we are discussing the sections of the form. So just a little bit about PCAR. PCAR was founded in 1975, and it is the first anti-sexual violence coalition in the United States. And we work to eliminate all forms of sexual harassment, abuse, and assault, and to advocate for the rights and needs of victims. PCAR has a network of Pennsylvania rape crisis centers, and that they serve every county in Pennsylvania. The rape crisis centers provide support, counseling, and resources to victims, family members, and significant others. They provide medical accompaniment during forensic exams and can provide support and accompaniment during the criminal justice process, and also provide assistance with sexual violence protection orders. They also can provide education and prevention programs in your communities. So there are 4 of us presenting on this webinar today, and we're each going to take a moment to introduce ourselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tammy Bimber. I am a sexual assault nurse examiner or forensic examiner, also known commonly as a SANE or a SAFE. And currently I am the SAFE coordinator at UPMC Chautauqua. I am also an expert SANE at the Duquesne Ames SANE program. And I am an instructor at the Jamestown Community College for the nursing faculty. I am also the immediate past president of the Pennsylvania International Association of Forensic Nurses chapter, and I'm a member of the Sexual Assault Evidence Collection Advisory Committee for Pennsylvania.
Hello, my name is Karen Wickwire. I am a nurse practitioner at UPMC Hammett and with UPMC Children's. I am a forensic examiner out of our emergency department and with our child abuse clinic here in Erie. I also am an expert SANE with the A&E program at Duquesne, and I am an adjunct professor at Gannon University in the nursing department. I am the current PA-IAFN chapter president, and I'm on the IAFN research committee.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deb Calhoun, and I am the Scientific Services Division Director within the Bureau of Forensic Services. I oversee the 6 regional laboratories within the Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory System. I am a member of the ASCLD, which is the American Society of Crime Lab Directors. I have my green belt in Lean Six Sigma, and I am a graduate of the West Virginia University Forensic Management Academy. I am also a member of the Sexual Assault Evidence Collection Advisory Committee for Pennsylvania.
Hi again, this is Babs or Barbara Schaefer. I'm the Medical Advocacy Coordinator at PCAR, and I'm also an associate member of the Pennsylvania chapter of the IAFN. I provide support and training to advocates, SANEs, and allied professionals, and I serve on a variety of state and national committees and boards to improve responses to sexual assault survivors. All right, so now that you know a little bit about us, we'd like to know a little bit about you. We have, I think, almost 200 people on this webinar, and I think the number is growing a bit. So I am going to open up a poll here, and, oh, I'm not sure why. Let me sort of see here. Let me do something here. Let me relaunch this. Okay, so and maybe you completed this for some reason. This may have been open, but if you can pick what describes you, your field best, that'll give us a good idea of who's here. And if you fall into that other category, if you would please just put in the chat what that field is, we'd appreciate it. I'll give you another moment here. Looks like we have a legal assistant, office administrator, and art therapist. That's cool. Health educator. All right, we got some prevention people on as well. Awesome. Okay, so it looks like we have about 49%, about 89 people that are in the advocacy field. Rape crisis, law enforcement, we have 17%. Healthcare, 4. Forensic examiners, 11. I have 1 prosecutor, that's awesome. And some laboratory people, some campus admin, and some others. So terrific, thank you very much. It's good to know who's here. And as I said, this webinar will be recorded. So certainly let your colleagues know, and they can access this webinar in the near future from the PCAR website and also the PAIFN website. All right, so, sorry, my mouse is a little sluggish here. So today our plan is that when this webinar is complete, you'll be able to explain anonymous reporting and testing options to a victim and accurately complete the form and carry out the anonymous reporting and testing processes. And I want to just note that during the presentation, we'll be primarily using the term victim, although you may hear patient or survivor when we refer to the person presenting at the emergency department for care or in various scenarios, but they will be using these terms interchangeably for this purpose today for our training. So what is SATEC? The Sexual Assault Testing and Evidence Collection Act refers to a comprehensive and precise process for testing sexual assault evidence and notifying victims. It allows adult victims to have evidence collected and tested anonymously, and for the evidence to be held for the full duration of the statute of limitations if the victim does not consent for evidence to be tested. And we have a few sort of bullet points here as an overview of the Act, and these will be covered in more detail throughout our training this afternoon, but SATEC creates timeframes for taking custody of the kit and evidence. It specifies minimum time in which evidence must be retrieved from the hospitals or exam site, stored and tested, provides anonymous reporting and testing options and rights for adult victims. And it requires written consent from the victim to test evidence. Evidence must be retrieved from hospitals, stored, and tested. It requires testing of kits in law enforcement custody that meet certain criteria, and requires law enforcement to annually report custody of sexual assault kits as of December 31st. And the information is due each year by January 31st. So I'm going to hand things over here to Deb.
Okay. The law establishes the Sexual Assault Evidence Collection Program, and it establishes that the Department of Health shall do 4 things. One is be responsible for determining the minimum standard requirements for rape kits. And that is accomplished through a multidisciplinary committee comprised of members from the Department of Health, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, SAFE and SANES, prosecutors, law enforcement, and laboratory personnel. Second, they review the minimum standard requirements and paperwork every 3 years to ensure the evidence collection is up to date and current. And that can be found on the Department of Health website. Third, they are to test and approve rape kits for use in Pennsylvania. And fourth, it ensures that the training is provided to hospitals, child advocacy centers, and healthcare professionals to make sure that evidence is collected properly and that the victim's safety is prioritized. Training can be provided by Pennsylvania State Police laboratory personnel. Okay. When consent for testing of the kit is immediately granted, medical personnel will notify law enforcement where the crime occurred within 12 hours. Then law enforcement will pick up the kit within 72 hours of notification. Evidence will be sent to the lab within 15 days of the time of consent. Labs must complete the testing within 6 months of when they received the evidence. The law states that district attorney, in consultation with local law enforcement, shall establish policies and procedures to ensure that timely submission of evidence has occurred. When consent for testing is not initially granted at the time of evidence collection, the medical facility must still notify local law enforcement within 12 hours. The kits must still be picked up by local law enforcement within 72 hours of notification by medical personnel. The kits must be preserved and stored for the maximum applicable statute of limitations. If and when consent for testing is granted, the kits must be sent to the lab within 15 days of a receipt of consent. And then again, the labs must complete the testing within 6 months of when the kit was received. According to the statute, victims must consent to have their kits tested. For victims who choose to report at the time of the exam and evidence collection, consent can be obtained right away. In cases where the victim chooses to wait to report after having the evidence collected, the victim will need to provide consent at that time they decide to proceed with reporting and investigation. The consent form that's pictured here is the one that's found with the current kit paperwork. Counties can develop their own consent forms. Our recommendation is to make sure that the form is not burdensome to the victim and only gathers the relevant information that pertains to the consent for testing. I think I need to go back. Babs, are you able to take
Yeah,
that back?
sorry about that. I don't know. Previous, let's see. There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Apologies to everyone. We are screen sharing and remote control sharing, and it's a crazy show here.
Yes.
Deb, there's a question in the chat to clarify the piece about the 6-month testing.
So I'm sorry, what is the question specifically?
Just clarifying that then even if somebody waits to report, that the kit still must be tested within 6 months.
Once the laboratory receives the kit, that testing must be completed within 6 months of the laboratory receiving the kit. And then the kit should have been submitted to the lab within 15 days of receiving that consent. Hopefully that answers that question.
And I encourage you, if you have questions, to use the Q&A feature. Hopefully you can see that at the bottom of your screen. And that way we can make sure we don't miss things as we go along.
So another consent form is a generic form that was developed in collaboration with the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape and the state police, which has been adopted by several counties. The state police crime labs will accept kits without a consent form, but law enforcement is still strongly encouraged to include the consent form when the evidence is submitted. Both the generic form and the form that you see on the screen are part of the kit paperwork, can be found on the Department of Health website under the sexual assault evidence collection.
There's a question about incidents that occur outside of Pennsylvania, with the comment that this person has dealt with jurisdictions as far as Europe.
And that's really difficult because where it occurred and where the kit is collected matters. So if the kit is collected within Pennsylvania, you would still use the Pennsylvania kit. However, it is up to the jurisdiction where the assault occurred to initiate the investigation. So you would really be up to the mercy of that jurisdiction to come and get the kit, knowing that their state laws or, you know, country laws may differ than Pennsylvania's.
Deb, are you able to turn? Do you need me to switch?
I did, yes.
Okay.
So the anonymous or unidentified victim. So just a reminder, this is a good time to make sure, again, that you have your forms, the anonymous reporting forms out in front of you, because we will be reviewing these in detail in the next several slides. Victims may elect to have kits tested while remaining anonymous. These forms can only be used for victims ages 18 and over. If the victim is less than 18 years of age in the state of Pennsylvania, that victim cannot report anonymously. The anonymous reporting form and instructions do help to facilitate the process. They're a nice guide. Both the patient visitation number from the hospital, and we'll talk about that in more detail on the next couple of slides, and the law enforcement incident number that is used and placed on the form help to track that kit and the evidence. So this is a nice overview of the forms. And like I had mentioned, we will be going through each one of these sections in detail to help explain what they mean. You will not be using these forms if the victim does decide to cooperate and provide their identity to law enforcement. So the only time you will be using these forms is if the patient chooses to remain anonymous and not provide their identity. Some basic tips for our healthcare workers. Since you cannot use the patient or victim's name on the forms as part of their identification, it's recommended that you use a number that can be easily tracked for the victim's case, such as the patient's identification number or the financial identification number. And oftentimes healthcare facilities have that type of a number that they do assign to each patient visit. You want to avoid the use of a medical record number or date of birth, or it's highly recommended to avoid those numbers because it's difficult to be visit specific with a medical record number because it includes the patient's medical record from birth to death. And date of birth, you can have victims with the same date of birth. Random number generating can also be challenging to keep track of. When the envelopes are labeled inside the kit, the stickers can be placed on the envelopes inside the kit. On the outside of the kit, you will use the number that you've chosen, the assigned number, such as the patient visitation number or financial identification number. No names will go on the outside of the kit. The information that does go to the crime lab will be assigned by the case number, and these numbers are assigned by law enforcement.
There is a question in the chat asking the maximum number of years the kit will be stored as evidence.
So the kit should be stored for the maximum statute limitations, and we encourage you to talk to your prosecutor, your district attorney's office for information on the statute limitations. That would be probably the minimum length of time the kit could be stored. And the statute of limitations has changed very recently. The last legislative session changed that a bit. So it depends on when the crime occurred and the age of the victim at that time. So we just encourage you to connect with your district attorney's office or the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association for that information.
So we're going to go through the first page of the form and kind of break down all of the sections here. So if you have your form in front of you, this is the very top, and you can see in the upper right-hand corner that there is space for a hospital label, or a hospital sticker. And the reason for this is that whichever healthcare facility or clinic you're working at, you're going to need to keep a copy of this. And if that is something that you are going to store, if you're, a forensic coordinator or something, or is going to get scanned into your medical record, somehow you need to be able to identify whose information this is for your own records, and in case somebody does request it later on. This next line is kind of a given. It's the healthcare facility where the exam is taking place. There is a place here for the patient's date of birth so that age can be identified. This alone is not an identifier. Regardless of where you work, if you go into your computer system and type in, a date of birth, you're going to get a lot of hits. And so that alone is not going to identify somebody. The next section is the patient visit identification number that Tammy was mentioning. So there needs to be some sort of anonymous number that the patient is assigned that you can reference later on. And the best recommendation is to use some sort of visit identification number, or what some facilities call a financial identification number. And that is different than the medical record number, and it ties directly to a specific visit. This is so that if, say 3 years down the road, a patient decides that they want to report and talk with police and have their evidence tested if it hasn't been already, they can coordinate between everybody with one number to identify who that victim or patient is. The date of the exam and then the incident number that you get from law enforcement. So even though these victims are going to be reporting anonymously, and even if they don't want to report or don't want to have their kit tested, the evidence still needs to go to law enforcement, so an incident number will be created, and you can get that there. The next section is just a little checkbox to remind us that this form is not to be used for people under the age of 18, so that if you feel inclined to check this box, you should not use this form. And finally, just remember that the patient's name does not go anywhere on this page of the form. Excuse me. All right, we're going to start by comparing the different sections here. So there's 3 options for the victims to choose. The first is report and test. The second is report and hold. And the third is non-report and hold. Whichever one of these your victim chooses, they can only choose from one box. So if they initial in this first box under option A, everything must stay under option A. They cannot pick and choose between the different sections. And they need to initial each box and then initial on the line underneath the box. So in this first one, report and test, we are making a report to law enforcement regarding the sexual assault. So this is notifying a law enforcement agency that somebody has reported a sexual assault. This does not mean that the victim needs to speak with law enforcement at that time, and their name will not be, or other identifying information will not be provided. But we can tell law enforcement the information about the assault that occurred. In the next option, report and hold, the same is true. And again, none of their information is going to be released. Just we're going to be able to tell the law enforcement agency that the assault, has been reported. In the third option, the victim is choosing not to report to law enforcement or to participate in any investigation. They're allowing for the evidence to go to the law enforcement agency, which needs to happen, regardless of the choice here. But in this situation, no information is given to the law enforcement agency about the report. The next section here is talking about information gathered. And so in this option A, report and test, the victim is giving permission for their evidence and the information that is gathered to be released to law enforcement and to be tested at the lab. So the paperwork that the forensic examiner completes and the evidence that they collect will be given to law enforcement, and law enforcement can get that testing done in conjunction with the other consent form that we mentioned earlier on in the webinar. In the middle section here, they are consenting to the collection and storage of evidence at a law enforcement agency, but they are not consenting for their evidence to be submitted to the lab. So that's the difference between these two. And then in the last section, they are again understanding that their evidence will not be submitted to the lab. And then just to go over the other parts of these sections, in option A, the victim is saying they understand that things will be turned over to law enforcement, including evidence and paperwork. And again, that they know that there will not be any identifying information. That for evidence to be tested, though, it may be necessary to request samples to exclude partners. So there's some education that needs to be done when people are choosing these options. Tammy's going to talk about that a little bit more later, but you can see how these situations can get complex. And then finally, they understand that if evidence is tested, that law enforcement will receive the results. In the report and hold section, the victim is acknowledging that they can change their mind about evidence being released and tested at a later time. And they are acknowledging that they understand that law enforcement must hold the evidence for the maximum of the statute of limitations. And then under non-report and hold, they are understanding that they again can change their mind and have their evidence turned over and tested. They again are acknowledging the hold of the evidence for the statute of limitations. And then importantly, they're also acknowledging that they understand that a delay in reporting the collection of the evidence, may affect collection of evidence from a suspect or from a crime scene, and that this can create challenges for the investigation and prosecution of the sexual assault. It's really important that victims understand the decisions that they're making, because in the heat of the moment of, a terrible thing that has happened, sometimes the idea of talking to law enforcement or moving forward or, having evidence that comes through, or having to involve other people or law enforcement going to their home or to the scene may all be very overwhelming. But we need to make sure that we are helping these victims make educated decisions and understanding that this is an option for them and we want it to be an option, but that they also may not have the same outcome as had they reported and had testing sooner, really is going to be important to explain. So let's break down these sections one more time. So report and test. So the healthcare provider reports to law enforcement that an assault happened. The patient remains anonymous. No identification information is given to law enforcement. So no name, address, things like that. However, information is given to law enforcement. So the sexual assault paperwork with the history and the exam findings is still turned over, but the examiner needs to make sure that this does not have identifying information such as a name on it or an address on it. The victim does not have to talk to law enforcement. The kit and evidence can be tested, and information about other partners may be requested. And then if the kit is tested, then law enforcement will receive the results. In the middle option, report and hold, again, the healthcare provider reports to law enforcement that an assault happened. The patient remains anonymous. No identifying information is given. The information, such as the paperwork, is still given to law enforcement. The victim does not have to talk to law enforcement, but now the kit will be stored and not tested until the victim changes their mind or at the end of the statute of limitations, possibly. The victim can change their mind at any point in time about the testing, and the law enforcement agency must hold the kit for at least the statute of limitations. And in the final option, non-report and hold, again, the healthcare provider reports to law enforcement that an assault happened. The patient remains anonymous. No identifying information is given to law enforcement. The evidence in the kit must be turned over. It is not in this situation for the healthcare facility to now store the kit. It must still be given to law enforcement, as we mentioned earlier on, and they must pick it up within 72 hours. The lab needs paperwork in order to complete evidence testing in the best manner. And so in the circumstance that the victim would change their mind, they're going to need that paperwork. But in this case, we can't give the paperwork to law enforcement. So a copy of the paperwork must be sealed in the kit, either inside the kit or sealed in that envelope on the back, which is probably what most of you are doing now, is putting in the envelope or in the kit, but you may not be sealing it if it's not an anonymous report. We need to make sure that that information goes with the kit in a way that's not able to be accessed by anyone else at that time. The kit will then be stored by law enforcement for the statute of limitations, and the victim can change their mind at any time about testing. And then again, they're acknowledging the downside of a delay in testing. So I think that this option really highlights the importance of being able to track things. So the kit itself will have that anonymous number on it and maybe the law enforcement incident number, and that's it. And so if 3 years from now, a victim goes to an advocacy center and says, 3 years ago, I was sexually assaulted in Erie, for example, we use that because that's where I'm from, in Erie, and I know that I was at, UPMC Hammett, then the advocacy agency would contact me and I would say, okay, what is the patient's name? And I would be able to look up their name and then find which number we use to identify their kit. And then I could go back to the law enforcement agency or give that information to law enforcement and say, this anonymous kit that you have with this number this person, will be when maybe coming to report, or some sort of conversation along those lines, depending on how everything unfolds. But that is the type of way that things will need to be tracked.
Deb, you're on mute. That's all right.
Thank you.
Who has not done that?
There's a couple of questions. I don't know if we want to answer a couple of them. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, Karen, go ahead, please.
One of the questions was, who is responsible for storage? And so the answer is that law enforcement agencies are responsible, and there is a way to report if the kits are not picked up.
And I can cover storage a little later too.
Okay.
And there are several questions here related. I think there's some confusion, Deb, as you get through this to your slides about how law enforcement is involved along with the anonymous reporting as I read through this. So maybe you can really clarify that well. I know you're going to talk about that in the next few slides.
Okay. And then anything that's not covered, we can go back to. So for page 2 of the anonymous reporting form, this addresses multiple aspects required by the statute, and it really provides the mode of contact. So first, you have to still have the patient visitation number, and the law enforcement number still gets recorded at the top of this form to assist with the tracking. And that's the key reason. It's all to allow for tracking at a later time. The next section down, this contains valuable information, contact information, both for the victim and for the law enforcement agency, so that the law enforcement agency would know how to contact the victim or the representative if necessary. So the victim receives this information in this top section, including the name of the law enforcement agency, their address, their incident number, and their phone number. And that is so that they can contact the law enforcement agency if they make that decision to do so. And they might want to contact the law enforcement agency if they want to provide more information and details about the incident, if they want to receive the status and notification regarding their kits, including the results, and also to notify law enforcement of any changes in their contact information. The second section down on this, on the second page, all victims, including anonymous reporters, have a right to be notified about the status of their sexual assault evidence. This form provides the vehicle to accomplish this for anonymous reporters. So the victim can decide the mode of contact, and they may be able to use anyone. They can use a family member, a friend, an advocate, at a rape crisis center. If you use an advocacy agency, you please put the name and the address instead of the individual person in case of the advocacy turnover. So in case that person is no longer associated with the agency, it's important to put the agency name there. The contact information is only for notification and cannot be used for investigative purposes. It may also be necessary to contact the victim or the victim's representative if there is a need for an elimination standard from consensual partners. Samples from consensual partners may be necessary to exclude them as a contributor to any DNA found in the evidence. And just to note on this form, in the interactive form, you'll see under where it says leave a message, and both of the yeses are clicked. In the interactive form, you have to click yes or no. If you have a paper form, you'll have to make sure that that is not, yes is not clicked automatically, as opposed to it being the intent of what the victim wanted to record there. Now, the bottom section on the second page of this form is to be used if the victim initially declined to have the kit tested, but decides at a later time to give consent for testing. This form was designed to be adaptable in the event the victim changes their mind about testing and wants to provide an identity and cooperate more fully with law enforcement. So this section would never be filled out initially, but would be used at a later time if the victim changes their mind and wants to record their desire for the testing to be done.
And before I move on here, Tammy, do you want to cover a couple questions?
Yes, I think many of them Deb just answered in regards to law enforcement. So if that's still not clear when you ask a question regarding law enforcement involvement and collecting for consensual partners, etc., please ask again. There is a, go ahead.
I'm sorry, there is one question. Just want to clarify, patient identifying information can be inside the kit. Yes. Will the patient's identity be protected by the lab if they want the kit processed but wish to remain anonymous? Yes, that is absolutely. In fact, any identification, any identifying information that's provided to the laboratory does not get scanned and entered into our laboratory information management system. It is only the what is on the evidence. So it is further protected and not disseminated any further.
There's a couple questions about like the police involvement, so and law enforcement involvement. I think to clarify, if we didn't already, is that law enforcement has to be involved with every single one of these cases now. So even if somebody does not wish to speak to the police or have the details of the assault released or have their evidence tested, the law enforcement agency that covers the jurisdiction where the reported assault occurred must still be made aware, and they must still pick up the evidence, and they are responsible for storing it. And in doing so, they will need to create an incident number. And I know that when this first went live, that was very challenging for a lot of law enforcement agencies to figure out how they're going to do that. And a lot of conversations stemmed around doing this similarly to when there's any other unidentified person that they are, interacting with, an other unidentified victim of a crime. And so there are some road bumps, but it definitely can happen. And once you do it once or twice, it'll be a lot more comfortable for everyone.
Yes, thank you. And that kit must be picked up within 72 hours to one. Healthcare has 12 hours to notify law enforcement, and law enforcement has 72 hours to pick up the kit.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead here, and we'll see what might be covered with some of these questions as we move along, and then we'll be sure to circle back to them at the end as well. So victims are the why in SATEC. I think it's important to remember that every kit represents a person, and SATEC provides for victims to seek justice alternately by allowing evidence to be collected anonymously, giving victims time to decide on testing and what type of reporting they wish to do. We know that window of evidence collection closes, so giving victims the opportunity to have evidence collected, even if they're unsure about what they wish to do at the time, is very important. And having some control over that can help them start in that healing process and also take back some of the control in their lives as well. And I know we mentioned this before, but it's very important to note that, again, this anonymous reporting form is really only for when a victim does not wish to be identified and known. In all other cases, this form is not to be used. And it is important to try to explain what that might mean in the whole processes. And I know that was discussed a little bit, but if someone wishes to remain anonymous and have their kit held, that is certainly absolutely their right, but it's important that they realize that it may be harder at a later time if they choose to have that evidence tested, because other evidence cannot be collected. And if there are any witnesses, it may be harder to interview them and get information as well. So if a victim does want to report and be identified and that case to move forward, it's very important to support that decision as well. So I know this is a time of great crises and it can be difficult to make a decision, but I think the best thing to do is to try to provide as much information as possible, allow that some time to decide, and then support that decision by the patient. Just a few highlights on the rights of victims under SATEC. Victims have the right to have evidence collected at no charge. Hopefully all of you are aware of the Victims' Compensation Assistance Program and how that can be accessed so victims are not billed for a forensic exam if they choose to have VCAP billed in lieu of insurance if they have it, or if they don't, the VCAP is billed. They're to be able to have evidence preserved at no charge, and also consult with a counselor from the Rape Crisis Center. They have the right to receive information about protection from abuse orders or sexual violence protection orders, and also get information about victims' compensation and restitution, and notification of information about the evidence.
The forensic examiner's role includes the collection of forensic evidence and photographing of injuries with the victim's consent. However, it's important to remember that the forensic examiner, that we don't lose sight of the primary goal of the medical exam, which is evaluating the overall health, safety, and well-being of the patient, including assessing the patient for injuries, determining safety plans for discharge, and assessing for things like suicidal ideation. Any emergent healthcare needs must be addressed immediately while trying to preserve the integrity of any evidence to be collected. Providing education about STI prophylaxis, including HIV, PEP, emergency contraception, evidence collection, and reporting options to law enforcement is vital so that the victim can make informed choices about their plan of care. It's important to have follow-up conversations with the victim after providing education and using methods such as teach back to ensure the victim understands the options he or she has chosen. So for example, if a victim chooses option B on the anonymous reporting form, the forensic examiner's role includes reviewing the victim's choice with them to be certain that the victim understands the sexual assault will be anonymously reported to law enforcement, so their name will not be provided, but the evidence kit will not be tested. So they will share the scenario, but the evidence kit will not be tested if option B is chosen. So it is okay to ask the victim the reason he or she made a certain choice and to assess the victim's understanding of that decision made. Forensic examiners work collaboratively with advocacy, law enforcement, and others as part of the multidisciplinary process. And ultimately, the goal is to provide high quality care and improve outcomes for the victims of sexual violence. And I see there is a question real quickly about how many days after a sexual assault occurs, which is really not in the realm of what we're focusing on today, but I will tell you that the standard of care for the Department of Justice really outlines that. And that's something for the evidence collection. And that's something you need to make a determination with your team, you know, in your practices or policies that you establish at your institution as to how far out you'll collect evidence, you will collect the evidence, or your multidisciplinary team.
And advocates are encouraged to work with healthcare providers and law enforcement on how to explain options to victims and how to best inform victims about their choices. And as Tammy explained, that is something that the healthcare provider would be doing as well. So it's important to work with your healthcare providers and law enforcement, that there's a team effort to discuss this. And as we've been saying, it's very important that victims be fully informed about the options and what their choices are. And there is a fact sheet on the PCAR website, and it's also one of the resources at the end of this webinar. The PCAR SATEC fact sheet outlines some of those considerations to discuss at this time. And perhaps the most important way that advocates can assist is to make sure that the systems are operating in a victim-centered way, educating victims of their options and rights, helping to facilitate the updating of contact information, and assisting with notifications are some examples of this.
To review the responsibility of law enforcement, they do need to take custody of the evidence within 72 hours of being notified by the hospital. They do need to get the victim's written consent to test evidence, and the advocate may act on the victim's behalf in this case. But consent can be rescinded up until the point that the kit is opened by the lab. But in order for that to happen, there does have to be a reported incident. So going back, the third option, option C, was a non-report and hold. Without that report, there can be no testing of that kit. So that is a critical element necessary along with the consent for testing. The rape kit is to be submitted to an approved lab within 15 days of receiving consent if the case meets the definition of awaiting testing and if the case has not reached final disposition. So this is a very important phrase in determining whether that kit is going to be submitted to the laboratory by law enforcement. Awaiting testing is defined as meeting all four of the following criteria. One, it has been collected and is in law enforcement's custody. Two, it has not already received DNA testing analysis. Three, it is related to a criminal case where final disposition has not been reached. And four, it should undergo DNA or other appropriate forensic analysis as determined by the law enforcement agency. So the kit must be collected from a hospital within 72 hours, even if the victim is not cooperating with law enforcement, if the victim is anonymous or you haven't identified kits, or even if the victim has not consented to having the kit tested. Regardless, the law enforcement agency still must take possession of that kit. The kits must be tracked and stored in compliance with the storage guidelines for the maximum statute of limitations or until consent is given. All kits, including anonymous kits, must be marked and tracked in a manner that maintains chain of custody. And then local jurisdiction may have policies in place to address the handling of such kits. And as a side note, if you have kits of unknown jurisdiction, they are to be picked up by the state police, the local state police barracks within the county where the kit was collected. Law enforcement has a responsibility for reporting as mandated by the statute. It requires police departments submit a yearly report disclosing the number of backlog kits that they have by December 31st or January 31st. Backlogged is actually defined as being greater than in their possession for longer than 12 months. The report of the compiled statewide data is posted to the Department of Health website by April 30th of that year. And the annual survey has shown to have had a significant decline in backlog kits since 2016, when the number of untested kits was first obtained. In regards to the laboratories, sexual assault evidence must be submitted to a lab that is approved by the Department of Health and with direct access to CODIS. Approved labs include the Pennsylvania State Police, Philadelphia Police Department, and the Allegheny County Medical Examiner's Office. Within the Pennsylvania State Police, we have 6 regional labs across the Commonwealth, and they are located in Harrisburg, Bethlehem, Erie, Greensburg, Lima, and Wyoming. Once sexual assault kit evidence is screened within the Pennsylvania State Police, the samples requiring DNA testing are then sent to a state police lab that's solely dedicated to DNA testing in our Greensburg area. Allegheny County and Philadelphia Police Department also have forensic laboratories approved to accept sexual assault evidence for both screening and DNA testing. These 3 labs all have access to CODIS, the National DNA Database, and the analysis of kits must be completed within 6 months for all 3 laboratories. The kit paperwork provides critical information about the assault. How testing is conducted is often based on the details provided in that paperwork. Laboratories rely on that information provided in the kit to determine how best to test the sexual assault evidence. Please include a copy of the victim's written consent to test within the evidence. The new kit paperwork, approved in 2020 and available on the Department of Health website, concentrates the most critical information to the first 8 pages of that form. Those 8 pages must be provided to law enforcement or included in the kit so that the lab has access to the information. It is advisable to include a copy of the victim's consent for testing with the kit. For Pennsylvania State Police labs, the sexual assault information sheet is also required to be submitted with the evidence. And please ensure that there is no liquid, urine, or blood for toxicology testing included in the kit. The toxicology testing for drug-facilitated sexual assault is conducted by either a private lab or a hospital lab, and not by the Pennsylvania State Police or the Philadelphia Crime Lab. In regards to the role of prosecutors, they collaborate with law enforcement and allied professionals to ensure compliance with the statute. While the law does not specifically name who will do the notifying, it does state that the victim must provide law enforcement and the attorney representing the Commonwealth with their up-to-date contact information. Normally, this is the district attorney's office. The district attorney should help to create policies and procedures for compliance and notification. Victim notification protocols are available at the Pennsylvania Office of the Attorney General website. Cases past the statute of limitations can still be tested, so consult with your prosecutor for further information. And please note, though anonymous reporting provides another option to a victim who is unsure how best to proceed, it is not ideal for the investigation and prosecution of that case. For that reason, reporting anonymously should not be encouraged if the victim would otherwise provide the identity, their identity to report the crime.
Oops, went too fast. Go back here. So I want to just get to this resource page. I know we covered a lot of information in an hour here. We'll get to questions, but I want to point out And hopefully you can actively connect with these links in the PowerPoint that you received. But we have the Department of Health evidence collection website, and this is where you'll find the paperwork, the minimum standard requirements, kit contents, also the anonymous reporting form that we just reviewed. And I think I may have said instructions already, but all of that is through the Department of Health and their Sexual Assault Evidence Collection Committee. And then you see the State Police storage and preservation policy. Deb just mentioned that for properly storing kits by police. And I'm sorry, I sort of like bumped this again, but we have the minimum standard requirements for sexual assault evidence collection here. I do not think this is actually a duplicate, but I apologize. If you open that, you'll see some additional information. And I think this was the general bulletin that comes out every 3 years about the minimum standard that I think either Karen or Tammy mentioned earlier. The Pennsylvania IFN chapter website is a wealth of information for forensic nurses. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And then the PCAR SATEC fact sheet is what I mentioned, which gives some overviews of the SATEC Act, as well as considerations for anonymous reporting and testing options. So we want to address additional questions here that we have not covered already.
There's a couple that I was gonna go through real quick here.
Please.
Somebody asked for people who work in a multiple hospital systems within their jurisdiction, but they have centralized SANE care. Whatever system you're using for tracking now, you can probably modify. You know, you have to track all of the patients that you see and keep a log of that. So, you know, you can probably figure that out. Please reach out to myself or Tammy. Also, we'd be happy to help you navigate that. And then there was a question, let me find it here. There was a question about when we don't know where the jurisdiction is. I'm trying to find it here. And so that's something you'll just have to sort out with your county. I know that in our county, the decision was made that if there were cases where we did not know the jurisdiction, that the state police, one of the barracks would agree to take it. And so, Deb, unless you have another thought, but that's kind of just county by county what we were talking about.
Yeah, that's actually in the statute, that if you do have a case of unknown jurisdiction, that the closest barracks to the where the kit was collected within that county should be the ones that take possession of that kit. So I think every major healthcare facility would know what the closest state police barracks would be, and that would be the one that you would contact for unknown jurisdiction. Not just anonymous reporting, but unknown jurisdiction. Anonymous reporting can still go to the local law enforcement where the assault occurred.
There's a question about if all Pennsylvania hospitals must offer anonymous reporting, even if there's not a formal SANE program. And the answer is yes, because under the Department of Health regulations, hospitals must provide sexual assault examination services. I did put the link to the state law in the chat too. And so, yes, you must still offer that. And then
mention the page numbers, Karen, there's a question about page numbers. Do we have to include all 5 pages of the anonymous reporting form? Because they're numbered 1 of 5, 2 of 5, 3 of 5, and 3, 4, and 5 are the instructions on the forms.
I know the laboratory does not need that.
So you would only need to include pages 1 and 2, correct?
Yes. Unless the law enforcement agency would also need the instructions for guidance as far as what their responsibility is if they're not sure of it.
So probably the best answer would be to check with your jurisdiction.
Yes. I did see a question, how does the kit get tested if the victim isn't reporting? And the answer, it does not. If the victim is choosing option C, which is a non-reporting, then they're not acknowledging that any crime occurred and that the kit will only be held. There will not be any testing. And that's actually required not just by this statute, but also it has to do with the use of the DNA CODIS database. Only it has to be a crime that is being investigated for the evidence to be tested and uploaded into CODIS. So having that acknowledgement that a crime occurred is very important as far as the paperwork and what's recorded for later testing by the laboratory.
Somebody asked about, they had an incident where a detective was inquiring whether or not there's a law that law enforcement have to be notified of any sexual assault, regardless of whether or not the victim wanted to make a report. And so I think that's where this just comes down to a little bit of terminology. And so sexual assault is not a mandated report in Pennsylvania, but we're saying that evidence must be stored by law enforcement. And part of that is because a hospital is not a place to be storing evidence, or a sexual assault clinic is not a place to be storing evidence. And that's what was happening before. And so, and that was contributing a lot to some of the backlog as well, because there wasn't, previously that option for kits to be tested that maybe weren't, in an anonymous fashion. So law enforcement needs to be notified that evidence exists that may be related to a crime, and they need to take possession of it. But that's not the same as reporting a sexual assault. And I hope that we have clarified that a little bit through this process, but I'm not sure what role this person that asked the question is in, and they're anonymous, but if you want some further clarification, please reach out to us. I did see a question in the chat that's a really good one about, is there eventually going to be a statewide tracking number system?
Babs, do you want to take this or should I?
I am happy, but please chime in. So there are some states, probably at least a dozen, maybe I know more now, that do have kit tracking systems. And that is something that is sort of in the very early stages in Pennsylvania. There is interest in having a system like this. And it is expected that there will be a bill probably in our state legislature addressing this issue at some point fairly soon.
But in preparation of having a statewide tracking system, online tracking system, in the last update to the minimum standards of the rape kit, the manufacturers have been advised that the new rape kits are to have a barcode and a unique alphanumeric number associated with each kit, in hopes of having that already established by the time that we do get a online tracking system up and running. That little piece of how they will follow through the tracking system will already be in existence. I do need to clarify that unique tracking number that is going on the new rape kits does not replace or the patient visitation number that is necessary on the paperwork for the anonymous reporter form. They are two different numbers.
Thanks, Deb. I want to circle back just real quick on the question that Karen was answering. I had to scroll down to sort of find that about reporting to law enforcement. And there is, I think this might be in reference to a statute under Title 18 about reporting an injury or a crime to law enforcement. And we are having some discussions sort of about that to try to remedy that issue about reporting. I mean, hospitals have to contact law enforcement to make sure, well, to get an incident number and to hand off that kit to law enforcement. But I know that can cause a little bit of confusion with under that statute about reporting an injury or crime. So I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense, but feel free to contact me. We have our emails on the next slide, and I can try to help a little bit with that as well.
There's several questions asking about inmates or prisoners and if they can utilize this.
Yes, well, we are wondering that same thing too, too, to be completely honest with you, given that this is a pretty new law. We've been having some discussions just about whether that is truly viable. And from what I know about PREA and facilities, institutions, is that if there is a sexual assault that's been reported, there would be an investigation within that institution. And then if the incarcerated victim would be sent out for a forensic exam, the only sort of process that I know of is that there would be corrections officers or staff with the incarcerated victim while they're getting that exam. So technically, I'm not quite sure how that would look in an anonymous report, or if that is really realistic, because it would not be completely anonymous. I mean, it would be known at least by some staff within the facility, whether or not the victim would have that option of having it anonymous and no identifying information number on the kit. I think that is really something that probably needs to be discussed within your jurisdictions. We don't have really any examples of that happening yet, but I'm happy to have some more conversations around that issue. So please feel free to contact me, because we're just not really sure how that would look for a true anonymous, or as anonymous as it can be, kind of reporting processes.
And I see 2 questions regarding consensual partners. How can information about other partners be obtained if the reporter is unknown to law enforcement? This is no doubt a very complicated situation, and it will be very difficult for law enforcement to get the information necessary. Hopefully that information was captured during the exam by the Safe for the Sane who was filling out the paperwork, and that information will be at least made available to the lab, knowing that they will have to obtain an elimination sample. Hopefully the victim has provided some contact information, either through a representative, family, friend, advocate, where the law enforcement agency would be able to reach out through that avenue to obtain elimination samples. But there's like no easy way to go about doing that when the victim has decided to remain anonymous. So it will raise some challenges. And then the other question was, I guess that was both. So even if the victim chose option A and wanted it tested, again, obtaining those samples from a consensual partner are very important to the process, so that you don't have the wrong profile uploaded into CODIS. You wouldn't want the DNA profile of the consensual partner uploaded. You would want to make sure that only the perpetrators gets uploaded into CODIS.
There's a comment about the complexity of the form and whether or not it could be simplified. And I think I want to just share how many hours were spent having this exact conversation. And the challenge is that we have to address all of these things and make sure that the victims are acknowledging that they understand. You know, for example, in the 3rd section where it talks about, you know, that this may make the, you know, exam more complicated, or, you know, a delay, or the significance of a delay in reporting and testing to a case, we have to make sure that people are signing that and acknowledging that, so that later on, you know, they can't say, well, I didn't know that this was going to jeopardize my case. And so we certainly appreciate that this is a complicated form. And that's why we wanted to do training like this. And I think that a lot of the forms seem complicated at first. Some of the HIV and PEP forms seem very complicated. The consent in and of itself is lengthy, and it's changed, and there's lots of different caveats there. And so I think taking away from this ways that you can simplify it for the victims is what's going to be important. The paperwork itself is complicated, but, you know, especially if you're an examiner role or an advocacy role, being able to explain it in a way that the victims can understand is really important.
That's well said, Karen. There's a question about emancipated minor that is coming up. And as I've always understood it, and Debbie, you can clarify, is that in the state of Pennsylvania, at least, that for reporting crime, it goes by the patient's age, not their emancipation status. Is there something different that you've been told?
I have not, and I am not well versed in that area, so I wouldn't want to necessarily weigh in on it and give any incorrect information.
So go back to your jurisdiction and talk to your DA would be best in that situation.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, the jurisdiction I worked in said that they were going by the patient's age and not their emancipation status.
Deb, there's a question about which pages of the paperwork, the consent and the anonymous reporting form do they want, or does the lab want? And then another question is, if the victim chooses option A and the kit is tested and they can identify DNA through CODIS, the results will go to law enforcement, but will they investigate or question potential perpetrators without the victim's permission?
Again, you'll have to work with the law enforcement agency, because I think every agency is going to handle that a little differently with the challenges of an anonymous reporter. They may not be able to proceed very far without that information. So again, we are trying to provide these options for a victim at the time that the kit is collected, but it will have downstream effects as far as the ability of the law enforcement agency to effectively conduct an investigation. So it really, there's too many factors that go into, that would have to be handled on a case-by-case basis. So,
and another
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Were you going to say more?
I do see that there's two questions related to drug facilitated sexual assault testing, that this process doesn't seem to take that into account, and it really does not cover that. So how do you go about that testing while you keep the victim anonymous? Again, you do have a code, a number. So whatever facility, private lab or hospital, would do that testing for this particular case, you'll have to check with them how they would want to proceed if they were only operating with a code or a number as opposed to a patient name.
And there's another clarification about contact information. Can the patient opt out of providing that? Yes, they can.
But that does mean that they will not have a means of being notified as far as the status of their case, of the evidence.
So there is another question here about if a kit is destroyed and notification per the statute that it's expired.
So according to the statute, if the victim wishes to be notified and has provided the adequate contact information for notification, they're to be notified, I believe it's 60 days prior to the destruction of the kit. Though the statute does not say who is to do that notification, which is why we mentioned that in conjunction with the district attorney's office and the law enforcement agency, they should work on what that notification protocol is. And there is a high level protocol found on the Pennsylvania's Office of Attorney General on their website as far as victim notification.
There's a question about how can a victim remain anonymous if they choose to have their kit tested later, if they provide their signature on page 2 of the form. And I know that we talked about this and that we've talked about this previously, and that there is a witness signature there. And so the victim needs to just make some sort of mark.
And they're not talking about the bottom part of page 2, where this is after the fact, the victim changes their mind and wishes to proceed with more involvement with law enforcement.
And so then the first page, they just need to make a mark, but yes, you're correct. I think actually they are asking about page 2, now that I look at it again. That's after the fact that they're signing that.
Yes.
If their kit was on hold.
Right. So this, at that point, they would have changed their mind and wish to participate more fully with law enforcement and be willing to provide their name. So at that point, they would have to provide a signature that, yes, they want to proceed.
On the first page, it's just a witness signature.
Mhm.
So again, just to reiterate, yes, this recording will be available on PCAR's website and on the Pennsylvania IAFN chapter's website.
And we expect it probably will take about a week or so until this is posted on the PCAR website. So I would say by mid-February at the latest, we hope to have it posted.
And
there was one,
oh, go ahead.
there was one question that I sent somebody a message in reply that was like very specific to their facility. And I'm going to reply to another. So if you asked a very specific question related to something that happened to your facility and you did not get an answer, please email me. I'm messaging these people.
Yeah. Or any of us, honestly.
Yeah, or anybody. Yeah.
And while we're wrapping up these questions, we have about 10 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and flip to the next slide. So everyone on the webinar here can see our contact information. So yeah, if you need more clarification, please contact us.
There's a question about limited English proficiency, and I'm not sure if it means in different languages, if that's what you're asking for the paperwork. Will it be available for those with limited English proficiency at the time of the hospital visit? And I don't believe we have this form in any other languages other than English at this time. But I'm not sure if we have plans to create in other languages. Babs, do you know?
I do not know, and that I think is a good question that I can do some follow-up with the Department of Health on that to see if that is a possibility. And yeah, as Tammy was saying, I mean, if this is, I think the question might be around translating it into some different languages, perhaps. I think it's maybe what is being asked, but I will do some follow-up to see, find out some more information about that.
There's the last question in the Q&A section is, how does the Rape Crisis Center know what the status of the kit is? And that's a really good question. And so you will just need to make sure that your Rape Crisis Center also has access to that anonymous number. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that, but you can get, if you're presenting to the hospital with, or the clinic or wherever with a patient, you could develop some sort of separate documentation, which some people have. I know our the PAR in Allegheny County has developed that. So a way just to share that information. So you would need to work, locally through that to get the information so that you can help, victims get access to that information.
I'm not sure if we covered this or not, but to clarify, does lab want a copy of the patient consent, page 1 and 2, anonymous reporting and testing form? Yes, if possible, the lab would like to have that form. Though even if we do not have the consent for testing form, we assume that the law enforcement agency does have the appropriate paperwork to substantiate that. So our contract is with the submitting agency, and if they are asking us to test the kit, we will test it. But it would be ideal for us to have that consent form along with the first 8 pages of the paperwork that's from the kit paperwork, because again, that gives us the critical information around the incident that helps guide us through the testing protocol that we would want to follow to provide the best forensic evidence possible with that kit.
And then there's another question here. What part of the form is the follow-up for the 60 days prior to destruction? And that would be the part of the form would be on the second page, where the patient or victim provides some sort of contact person to be notified. But that would be the only way we would have a means or the information to make sure we're contacting that appropriate person for follow-up on the kit, correct?
I think that this is a good time to look at convening or reconvening your SART in your area. And, you know, this is a big change that we've worked through. And if you haven't worked through this in your community, or you don't have a SART or it hasn't met yet, you know, this may be a good impetus to get that, you know, those conversations going again. And any of us are happy to help with that process as well.
And I do see a question. Do police have to collect clothing, urine, and other evidence for anonymous kits? I would think that they would want to collect everything that the hospital has collected and hand it over. Though the statute technically only covers the actual kit, meaning the box. But even within that box, there's bags for outer clothing that shouldn't be packaged within the box itself. They can be packaged separately and handed over to law enforcement. So yes, law enforcement should be taking all the relevant evidence. And I would think that they would want to, so there's no gaps in their investigation.
And I think that would then answer the question from the SANE regarding that too. Yes, we're going to be collecting any relevant evidence, even if it's an anonymous report, just as though the person was reporting and providing their identity. You do everything the same way as far as evidence collection goes.
One last question was, are the police investigating the crimes with option A and B, or are they just made aware?
I think that depends on the jurisdiction and how much information they have to go on to investigate. If they have very limited information, they may not be able to go very far. But again, that's on a case-by-case basis and dependent on the investigating agency.
Okay, we have just a couple minutes yet. So if there are any more questions, please put them in the Q&A. I appreciate everyone attending and asking these questions. I know, as we've acknowledged, this is a complex processes, and it has taken quite a while to develop this form and work out a lot of these issues. So it's good to hear your questions and see how you're really thinking about this form.
And I'd also like to tag on to that to say, even if it was answered today and you're still unsure, don't be afraid to reach out to one of us again. We understand the complexities here. It took each one of us quite some time, I think, like Karen had said previously, to really understand this form. So yeah, please definitely reach out to any of us. And if we don't know the answer, you reach out to one of us, we'll be sure to pass it on to the others panelists today to make sure that you do receive the best answer possible, or we provide you with as much resource as possible.
So it looks like there's an ask for some more clarification around whether it is possible for police to investigate an anonymous report. And Deb, I don't know if you want to
Yeah, I think
any more.
I would say it's possible, but I think it's very, very dependent on the amount of information that they are provided as a way to move forward with it. You know, especially if they agreed to having the testing done and there are any results as, you know, from that testing. Again, it's a very challenging situation, especially when you consider the need for elimination samples from consensual partners. So is it possible? Yes. Is it extremely difficult? And yes. So I think, again, case by case basis and dependent on the investigative agency that has taken ownership of that kit.
And I think maybe also with that question, you know, I'm not sure if it's being asked because the victim may really want it to be investigated and pursued, but they still want to remain anonymous, or the opposite. So depending on what is happening during that time when this form is being discussed, that might really bode for a little more exploration into what the patient wants. If they're really concerned about being identified in any way and absolutely don't want anything moving forward, then perhaps that option where evidence is collected but no report is made and the kit is held is more of what they want. But yeah, I'm just thinking a little more about what the situation might be, and it might be helpful to try to explore that further with the individual in that situation.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Babs. And I know that Tammy and I have talked to new examiners about this a lot, that when our patients and our victims are making choices, we need to help them understand the choice and why they're making the choice. So it's certainly fair as an advocate or examiner or anybody, if the victim says, you know, oh, I want the anonymous reporting, you know, to make sure that we understand that they know what that means, but that they also know what normal reporting means. Because I think that people have a misconception of how the process is going to go, and that, you know, a week later, their genitals are going to be on a courtroom screen or something, you know. So I think that we have to make sure that we're giving all of the information for people to make an informed decision about what route is best for them, because many people do say that they see victims change their mind and go ahead and report once they understand, you know, what is going to happen and what truly it means to report anonymously.
And if the victim's priority is really to have the case investigated, they need to know that the best way to achieve that is to fully cooperate with law enforcement and provide that information.
And I think this is also a good time just to make sure that the services of the Rape Crisis Center are being offered at the time of the exam, that 24/7 an advocate can be available. I realize in these times of COVID, that may not mean someone in person, depending on where you are right now, or it may be a virtual accompaniment or a phone accompaniment. But I think making sure that the patient is connected with Rape Crisis, and that service can help with just exploring these options and letting them know there is an agency that's available to support them through the criminal justice processes, or, you know, whatever step they take, that they are not alone in that, might help with this issue as well. Oh, well, I want to thank everyone so much. I realize we're a little past time. We greatly appreciate you all of you joining us today and discussing this form. Do follow up with us if you have more questions. We're happy to help, and thank you again so very much for spending time with us today. So take care.